Hey, good morning, everyone. I am Christian Vaccari, and this is day 2 of the International Journal of Press Politics annual conference. I believe you know the rules already, and so without further ado, we will start with the first panel of the day, whose title is Hearing or Ignoring the Other Side, Causes and Consequence. And it is chaired by Jason Reifler from the University of Exeter, one of the members of our editorial board, to whom I'm very grateful for volunteering. And so I leave the floor to you, Jason. Thank you.
Okay, great. So what we'll do is we'll do them in the order of the email/program, and you'll have 16 minutes to present, and then we'll leave 9 minutes for questions and comments. And the reason why we'll do it sequentially is if you end up taking a little bit of extra time, then you take it out of your question Q&A period. And so other folks will have their full presentation time. And with that, who's up first? Is it? It is, I believe Jakob is up first. So Jakob, I will turn it over to you. And I imagine that Christian will give you screen sharing privileges if he hasn't already.
The paper I'm presenting is called Why Read News from the Other Side? Selective Exposure, Heterogeneous Treatment Effects, and Polarization of Social Media. And the paper is an attempt to contribute to the ongoing discussion about whether social media increases polarization or not. So, as most of you are probably well aware, there is a widespread concern that social media increases polarization by isolating people in echo chambers where they only see pro-attitudinal information which over time is expected to make people's attitudes ever more extreme. Yet, the evidence thus far show that people not only see pro-attitudinal information on social media, but rather that they frequently encounter both pro and counter-attitudinal information on social media. And that, if anything, echo chambers or highly biased information diets are found only among the most politically interested and ideologically extreme users. So, if there are no, let me see, where can I go further? So, if there are no echo chambers on social media, it has been argued that social media is probably likely only to have minimal impact on polarization, either because exposure to pro and counter attitudinal information is likely to cancel each other out over time, or in the case where people are exposed mostly to pro attitudinal information, they already have quite extreme attitudes, so such exposure is unlikely to have much impact on their attitudes. And this is where my wait a second. This is where my paper comes in, and the simple point I make is to say, before we conclude anything about the likely impact of social media and polarization, we need to first account for what information people actually read on social media and what effect it has on those who actually read it. This is at least relevant when we consider the most common type of political information on social media, which, at least in the case of Facebook and to some extent also Twitter, is a news preview. Even though people might be affected by exposure simply to a news preview, the primary effect of news is likely to come when people are exposed to a full news article outside social media. And so before we conclude anything about the effect of news on social media and polarization, we need to ask ourselves whether people are equally likely to click on pro and counter attitudinal news in their newsfeed. And we also need to ask ourselves whether pro and counter attitudinal news have any effects on those who actually read them, or whether their effects might potentially differ. And in making these points, I obviously draw on and also try to contribute to a rich tradition in selective exposure research, as well as a more recent trend in political communication, where scholars have tried to experimentally estimate the effect of information on people who are most likely to encounter such information outside the lab, as opposed to the effect of information, both for those who are likely and those who are unlikely to encounter such information outside the lab. In other words, the question that I try to address here is simply what is the effect of exposure to pro and counter attitudinal news on social media on people's attitudes, where people can choose if they want to read the news or not. And to answer this question, I did an online survey experiment with respondents that I recruited through Prolific. In the experiment, respondents were exposed to 3 news previews with accompanying user comments in a mock Facebook newsfeed, whereas a few other respondents did not see any information that this was a control group. And one of the 3 news previews and comments was about a current political issue, namely COVID-19 restrictions. And I randomly varied first whether this news article and user comment was pro or counter attitudinal relative to respondents' prior attitude, whether respondents were forced to click on and read the full COVID-19 news article, or could choose which of the 3 news articles in the newsfeed they wanted to read. The other 2 news articles were completely unrelated. One was about TV shows in December. The other one was a neutral article about Brexit negotiations. Finally, I varied whether the user comment had an angry or non-emotional tone. And then at the end of the experiment, I measured people's attitude toward COVID-19 restrictions so that I could estimate whether the experimental condition had made people's attitudes more or less extreme relative to the control group. And so what I try to do is to estimate 3 different things. So first, I try to estimate what is the effect of forced exposure to either pro or counter attitudinal news relative to no information, something that is usually referred to in the literature as simply as the average treatment effect. Then I try to estimate the effect of news when people can either choose to be exposed to the full news article or not, relative to no information. So what I do here is that I estimate the average effect both for people who choose to read the full COVID-19 news article and people who don't in the choice conditions, relative to no information. And then finally, I estimate or try to estimate the effect of exposure to news for those who actually read the full COVID-19 news article when they have the choice. And this is sometimes referred to as the average choice-specific treatment effect for those who actually select the information. And according to previous studies, under certain assumptions, it can be calculated simply as the average choice-specific treatment effect divided by the proportion of respondents who choose to read the full news article. Okay, so what do I find? Well, the main results of my paper are shown in this figure. And it shows you both the effect of pro and counter attitudinal news relative to no information, both when exposure is forced and when people can choose if they want to read the full news article or not. And as you can see on the right-hand side, pro-attitudinal news makes people's attitudes more extreme relative to the control group, both when exposure is forced and when people can choose if they want to read the full news article or not. In contrast, for counter-attitudinal news, we see that they do make people's attitudes less extreme when they are forced to read the news, but when people can choose if they want to read counter-attitudinal news or not, the effect of counter-attitudinal news is significantly reduced. So in other words, it seems as if choice, so whether people choose to read news or not, has a polarizing effect by reducing the effect of counter-attitudinal news, but not of pro-attitudinal news. How can we explain this? Well, the first, jumped a little bit. So how can we explain this? The first explanation is very straightforward. If we look at the proportion of respondents who choose to read the full news article in the choice conditions, we can see that people choose to read the full counter-attitudinal news article less often than a full pro-attitudinal news article. And this is despite the fact that the 2 other news articles in the newsfeed were completely unrelated and should not have any impact on people's likelihood of choosing the full news article. And so when we estimate the average effect of counter-attitudinal news, both for those who read the full news article and those who don't, it's obviously smaller than the effect of pro-attitudinal news, simply because fewer people read the full counter-attitudinal news article. So this is fairly straightforward. The second explanation, I think, is perhaps more interesting and perhaps more novel compared to the existing literature. And it is that it seems that counter-attitudinal news have a smaller effect on those who actually read them compared to counter-attitudinal news when people are forced to read them, whereas the opposite is true for pro-attitudinal news. So for some reason, people who choose to read counter-attitudinal news are not very much convinced by them, whereas the opposite is true for pro-attitudinal news. Those who read pro-attitudinal news are very much convinced by them, more so than those who are forced to read pro-attitudinal news. So to sum up, what I find in this study is that first, fewer people select counter than pro-attitudinal news on social media. And exposure to news on social media does have an effect on those who select the news, but its effect is smaller compared to the effect when people are forced to read the news for counter-attitudinal news, whereas the opposite is true for pro-attitudinal news. And for these two reasons, over time, one might expect news exposure on social media to increase polarization, even if people frequently encounter both pro and counter-attitudinal news on social media. Obviously, there are lots of follow-up questions. We might ask ourselves, why do pro and counter-attitudinal news have different effects for those who actually read pro and counter-attitudinal news? Is it due to people having different personal characteristics, or rather because different psychological processes are at play when people select pro and counter-attitudinal news? We could also ask, how long-lasting are the effects that I find? This is a one-shot experiment. Maybe the effects dissipate quickly over time. Would I find the same results if respondents had had different choices than the 3 news previews that I offered them? If I had focused on another issue than COVID-19? There are lots of relevant follow-up questions, but I think I'll just leave it here, and then I look very much forward to your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
So I think the best way to try and handle this is, if anybody has a question or comment, just write in the chat window, question or comment, and then I will call on you. In the interim, I will try and ask a question to give people a chance to get their thoughts together so they can ask their question or offer their comment. And I'm going to do the total chair's prerogative and ask a sort of tangentially related question that seems slightly off topic. So I think the study is really interesting. I think it's well designed, and I like the elements that are varying in there. One of the things that I find particularly interesting is how the emotional language decreases the click-through rate. In other places, we also know that up to a point that more emotional or toxic comments can increase engagement. And sort of, does this create a perfect storm for social media companies in terms of trying to keep people on their platform, in terms of encouraging or surfacing sort of emotional, more toxic comment? Not only does it keep people engaged on the social media platform, but it also seems to discourage people going off platform and clicking through to the article or information in question. And so I'll just, I don't know if there was a question in there, but I'll just leave it there and then give you a chance to briefly respond. And then a couple other people seem to have questions to bail me out here.
Thank you very much, Jason. No, that was a very interesting comment, and it's also something that, of course, was in my considerations when I designed the study. So I actually expected, I had this idea that the emotional tone, the angry tone of the comment would increase people's likelihood of clicking on the news article, and found the opposite. which I think is quite interesting. As you point out, it might lead to people staying on platform, engaging instead of actually reading the information. Because what I do find is that few people click on counter-attitudinal news when they are accompanied by an angry user comment. But those who do click on counter-attitudinal news accompanied by an angry user comment are highly influenced by it. So they are persuaded by the information. And so I think that's quite interesting. I mean, so, angry comments may have kind of like a double role in, those who click on them are actually persuaded by the news, but most people don't. So they kind of fail to fulfill their promise.
Okay, great. I think Christian had a question.
Yeah, I typed it in the chat, but I'm happy to repeat it. Great presentation, Jakob. I was wondering, if you could just give us a very descriptive piece of information, which is how big is the impact of choice? So given the chance to read or not read something that is pro and counter attitudinal, how many clicks do we expect? Because obviously if you find very different effects for forced and unforced exposure, then we also want to know how big of a difference, how big is the impact of forcing or not forcing?
Thank you very much, Christian. That's a great question. So I didn't give you the percentages in the figure that I showed you, but I can tell you that so obviously when exposure is forced, 100% they click on the news article. That's obvious. When people are given the choice, it's around 60% of respondents who click on the pro-attitudinal news article. And this is quite high given that there were 3 news articles, so you would think the chances were 33%, right? But I think it's because COVID was a highly actual issue at the time, so most people probably wanted to click on the COVID-19 news article. I tried deliberately not to write anything about COVID in the instructions for the experiment, so that people were free to choose whatever news article. But it probably because it was a highly actual, a lot of people clicked on the COVID news article. But when the COVID news article was counter-attitudinal, it was more close to 35-40% who clicked on the full news article. So there was, a difference of around 20 percentage points between pro and counter-attitudinal news, which I think is quite a lot.
Just as a quick follow-up, I find it very interesting, though, that the difference between forced exposure and unforced exposure to the pro-attitudinal article, if I understood correctly, is 40. It's 100 to 60. Yeah. So in a way, there is also an effect of people not caring enough to click on the news, right? It's not an effect because there's no news they get exposed to. But I wonder if in our, because there is all this debate about polarization, which is summarized in an excellent way, that a lot of people just don't care enough to be polarized by the news they get. They just don't want to get the news, and it's only the politicos that do. And I wonder if your design can shed some light on that by looking at this difference. Even the people that would choose something because they agree with it, actually a lot of them choose not to read it. To me, that it seems to illuminate an aspect of the issue that perhaps gets less attention when people are constantly searching for what polarizes people and how choice polarizes people. Well, a lot of people choose to exercise that choice by just staying away from the news, even if they agree with the news.
No, that's a great point. I actually expected the effect of news to be quite small for pro-attitudinal news, at least be quite small for those who choose to read the full pro-attitudinal news article. But what I find is in fact the opposite, that the effect for those who click on pro-attitudinal news appears to be higher than the effect when people are forced to read pro-attitudinal news. And previous studies, they have mostly looked at partisan news like Fox News, etc. in the US, and the point they make is that the people who watch Fox News are those who are most extreme already. So the effect of Fox News is quite small on people's attitudes. Well, I find in this case that, at least in my experiment, this is not the case, that people who actually read the news are quite affected by it. It might be, I mean, why do I find contrasting results? It might be that it's the issue I study. So I studied COVID-19. It was a fairly new issue at the time. Probably people didn't have a fully crystallized attitude towards the issue. And so it was possible to affect them, even though those who read the information. It's possible that if I had chosen an issue such as migration or something that's, you know, more well established, that the effect on those who read the news would be smaller. So in this sense, maybe my study speaks mainly to new and emerging issues, the effect of information on new issues as opposed to well established issues. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question from Bernhard before we switch over to Team Gothenburg.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for this super interesting talk, Jakob. And good to see you again. And I was wondering, in what sense the choice that you offer your subjects here is representative of the choice people would actually have in their Facebook feed. Usually people have more than 3 posts in their news feed, I guess, and we know that a very small percentage of news feeds are news. I think I recently read something from Facebook that said 4% or something. So is there a danger that you're kind of overestimating the effect as well, because there's just more opportunity to actually choose the news posts?
Thank you very much, Bernard. That's a very good question. In some sense, I think you're right. Obviously, as you say, only few of the posts that people see on Facebook are actually news. And obviously people can continue to scroll indefinitely. They have way more than 3 posts. So the design I made was trying to, I mean, if I had let's say 10 posts, the proportion of people who would have chosen the assigned news article would probably have been quite small, and it would have been difficult to estimate the effect of such news on people. So I tried to have few news posts, but then at the same time I tried to give people a news post about another highly actual political issue, as well as an entertainment news post, because I expected those who would be less likely to click on news would be those who are prefer entertainment, so they would kind of choose the entertainment post, and it would only be the ones with news interest who clicked on the news article. So I don't know if that is if that answers your question. I think your point is well made, and it might be that in the end people the effect that I find has to be somehow divided by how relatively infrequent people see news on Facebook. At least it might be that they see news more often on Twitter. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Jakob. That was a great presentation and a really cool project. And so I don't know who from Team Gothenburg is presenting, but they're up next, and I imagine Christian has given screen sharing rights, or we can ask somebody to. So we can just turn it over now.
They all have screen sharing rights.
Great. Presumably they have decided who's presenting.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Cool. Can you see my presentation as well?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm Adam, the first in line of the authors here. I'm from University of Gothenburg, and this is a paper I will present that is co-authored by me, Mats Ekström, and Per Oleskog-Tryggvasson. The title is Selective Exposure and New Political Cleavages, Media Use and Ideological Reinforcement Over Time. Let's see if I can make this. Yeah, so the basic thing that we are trying to understand or address in this paper is how new political cleavages influences selective exposure and ideological reinforcement. And we start off by observing two like macro level trends that have swept across Western democracies. The first one is on the political side, the emergence of new political cleavages, and specifically the socio-cultural value dimension, sometimes referred to as the liberal authoritarian dimension on the one hand, and on the other hand, the rise of new high choice media environment where people can increasingly select news sources and media based on their preferences and attitudes. And we try to sort of bring these macro level trends together in this paper from a citizen's perspective. We further argue that previous research on selective exposure and specifically in some of the European countries have been too narrowly focused on this left-right ideological dimension, and we need to look at other dimensions of ideology. So to what extent is this new emerging sociocultural value dimension structuring media choices? This is the key issue in the paper. And we do three things, basically. We compare the left-right or the socioeconomic left-right and cultural value dimension for news choices and relate that to selective exposure theory. We also study three broad categories of news outlets derived from a discussion about media systems. And then we also speak to the reinforcing spirals model by studying reciprocal feedback loops to understand the presence of ideological maintenance and reinforcement over time. So we spend some time in the paper or space to discuss the Swedish case in terms of how these more general international global trends relate to Sweden, and we argue that the Swedish case is kind of a typical case where we've had a very kind of unidimensional political system that has gradually sort of evolved into like a more where we have more ideological cleavages emerging, such as the cultural value dimension, and we also have the same kind of media developments that have been seen in many other democracies and countries. We build this study on a three-wave panel survey based on a probability sample, and we measure ideology based on attitudes towards specific policy proposals. So we have three items covering the socio-economic dimension, the left-right dimension, proposals relating to unemployment benefits, welfare, and income inequalities. And we have three items that cover the socio-cultural value dimension, refugees, tougher on crime, and multicultural society. So these two dimensions also emerge from factor analysis. So we can really say that these are two different aspects of ideology in the Swedish public. We measure news media use based on outlet-specific exposure and based on a discussion about changing media systems and where the Swedish media system comes from. We distinguish three levels of media where we have politically non-partisan broadcasting institutions, like we have the presence of strong public service media in Sweden. These are level one media, and then we have traditional press with politically affiliated editorial pages where there are clear distinctions between views and news. And then more recently developed political alternative media, sometimes called alternative left and alternative right media. So we study those three different categories of media in the Swedish landscape, so to say. So what do we find in terms of audience profiles? If we look first at yeah, here are the research questions. What is the relative importance of the socioeconomic left-right and the socio-cultural value dimension for explaining differences in news media use? And how does the relationship between ideology and news media use differ across these three levels of news outlets? So if we look first at the socioeconomic value dimension, the relationship between that ideological dimension and usage of these different media, and focusing first on level 1 media, the non-partisan broadcasting institutions, there is very little going on over the three waves. Basically no relationships. People are not more economically to the left or economically to the right. Level 2 media, the traditional press with the politically affiliated editorial pages, we see some action going on in terms of some media having a more economically right audience profile and some have an economic left audience profile. And then the third level of media, we have specifically the alternative left media with an audience being more economically to the left or socioeconomically to the left in terms of their ideologies. When we turn to the sociocultural dimension, however, we see new things sort of emerging. For instance, level one media have now clear ideological profiles, apart from the Swedish public service television, which is still kind of a catch-all news outlets. But you see that other media have clear culturally liberal audiences or culturally conservative audiences. On the level 2 side of news outlets, we also see more things happening, but we also see that the tabloids, Aftonbladet and Expressen, have a distinct conservative profile, while Dagens Nyheter, which is like the Swedish New York Times or the Guardian, have a more culturally liberal audience profile. And then the political alternative media shows a clear culturally conservative on the alt-right side, basically. Another way of looking at the Swedish media landscape from an ideological perspective is to spatially position each media outlet along a socioeconomic value dimension and a sociocultural value dimension. And here you would have like media with audiences that are both culturally conservative and socioeconomically to the right. And here are media kind of on the opposite end of the scale. So in the next step, we look at whether there is any evidence for ideological reinforcement over time using the panel structure of the data. And we make use of two different types of measures for media use, both one big news diet measure, which captures exposure to all the different outlets that we have in there and weigh in their ideological slant. And we also look at outlet specific measures. In terms of modeling, we use a random intercept cross-leg panel model. And for those of you who are familiar with these models, these separate between the between-person variation that is kind of stable over time from the within-person variation over time. So compared to a more like standard classic cross-legged model, here you can actually differentiate between the between-person part and within-person parts. And looking for reinforcement, this is kind of the dynamic that we are interested in here. So what do we find? Nothing in terms of within-person dynamics. There's very little evidence for dynamic within-person effects over time, but much more stable evidence for between-person relationship. So we cannot say that there is ideological reinforcement over time, either if we look at the outlet-specific measures or the comprehensive diet measures that we have in there. So summing up here, the main findings and some of the implications, we find that the sociocultural value dimension is more important than the socioeconomic dimension for structuring news choices. In that sense, we see that ideology has no unidimensional influence in selective exposure. But we also see that the social cultural value dimension complements rather than replaces the economic dimension. And some of the previous research, we argue, kind of may underestimate some of the influence that ideology has on news choices by looking at the left-right ideology aspect exclusively. Secondly, we also see that the socio-cultural value dimension structures news audiences in rather unique and distinct ways. We see basically new cleavages among audiences or divisions among audiences emerge. And two of those examples are that we can see that this dimension is clearly related to level 1 outlets, the non-partisan broadcasting institutions, which we cannot see with the classic left-right dimension. We also see that this dimension is also clearly related to a commercial or tabloid dimension of journalism, which could be related to discussions about media populism and media logic and so on. So we see this not only on the newspaper side with the tabloids, but also in terms of the commercial television channel that we have included. There's a clear tabloid dimension in these news choices. Finally, we find stable between person but not within person effects, and we could say that this reflects systematic de facto selective exposure, which is stable over time, but no intra-individual ideological reinforcement effects over time. So basically, the main takeaway of this paper is that we want to basically highlight the role that this new ideological or emerging ideological dimension may play for news choices that has been partly neglected in previous research, we would argue. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Another great and super on-time presentation. That's that is amazing. I'm not sure I've ever been at a conference where there have been the first two presentations have been under time, not only on time, but under time. So I'll do the same as before. If you have a question or comment, just put it in the chat window. But I will start with a question. So on the cultural dimension of ideology, being able to differentiate between level 1 media outlets, how much is this specifically to news content from those, or is this to anything on those broader platforms? Although I've spent some time in Sweden, my Swedish is not sufficiently good that I can differentiate between different level 1 Swedish broadcasting platforms.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. That's a very good question, which we don't address in the paper. But if I kind of speculate, I would guess that there is a certain like genre or channel dimension at work here, rather than specific news outlet selection. So what we see here, these patterns partly reflect that people with different sociocultural ideologies are also more or less likely to tune into certain channels, and it is it is striking that those news outlets on level 1 that we've seen also differ in terms of whether they are more like classically elite oriented or more targeted towards broader sort of segments of the population in terms of the level of entertainment profiles and so on in those channels. So there may be more broader sort of selection processes at work here, I guess.
Yeah, that was going to be my question: is how much of this is specifically about its news or information versus audience segmentation across different, that it's actually separation in the entertainment programming rather than the news programming that's generating the different audiences. BBC4 in the UK gets a very different audience than MTV, for example. I mean, that's a bad set of comparisons, but I wonder how much that's the case, and I wonder if you have any leverage to be able to figure that out. Is it just completely different audience profiles? One is the olds, the other is the youngs, one is the edgy, one is the boring, or is it really something about? And I think there's an interesting. I think it's interesting either way. So if the differentiation is that it's not the sort of the news and it's just broader audience segmentation, I think that's probably interesting. And if it's somehow the news and it's not broader audience, that it's really specific to the ideological component and not other, that isn't explained away easily by other demographic factors, I think that's also interesting. So I think you can win either way. And I see that our first comment and or question has come in. This is from Jakob or Jakob Ohme. And so I will let him ask his question/comment.
Yes. Hi, Adam. Great presentation. Just a quick question, because you now looked at both, like the classical left-right distinction and the new socio-cultural dimension. I was wondering if you compared it directly, because it was a bit difficult to kind of like compare the two slides in my head. And do you have a clear finding? And if not, what do you think is the more relevant dimension for selective exposure? So what drives people more strongly these days? Is it their political orientation, or is it more the social cultural dimension? I couldn't figure out if you compared this directly or if this is just a question that I had. So I would appreciate the clarification. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jakob. We did compare them directly. The first graph with the different effects plot, these are directly compared to one another. But in the third figure, where we kind of plotted the different outlets on spatially, that's more like descriptive. I mean, that's a tough question you raise, because on the one hand, we see quite clear like distinctions in terms of new choices based on these ideological dimensions. But when we start to look at what is kind of typically considered the best evidence for ideological selective exposure, there's the within part, we see nothing going on. So it's not really clear whether it's actually ideology that drives those news choices or these cleavages, or something else, because and that's kind of one of the main advantages of these types of modeling techniques, that we can separate between that. But at the same time, we also control for a bunch of socio-demographics and other types of personal factors in there. So I think that the thing we can say is that there are cleavages that follows certain ideological lines more in favor, so to say, for the cultural value dimension, but we don't have the evidence to say that this is actually the driving factor of these news choices.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question from Ozan.
Hi, Adam. Great presentation. Thank you. So I was particularly interested in this intra-individual no differences. So can you talk more about its implications and whether that might be a different result for particular segments of the audience? For example, younger individuals who might go through political socialization or like a important big political event, a change in a party position with respect to policy positions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ozan. Good question again. First, we haven't really looked at conditional factors or moderating factors here, so we cannot really say anything about subgroups here, but that may be an interesting way forward. When it comes to like the bigger issue about the differences between the intra-individual and inter-individual findings, there is certainly one substantive argument saying that this is actually a reflection of reality, that there are distinct between person differences, but there is nothing going on at the within person level. So basically ideology has no like causal impact on your news choices. There is also a methodological part or potential explanation saying that we have too little information to actually identify within person effects over time. So even though we have many respondents, we only have three waves of panel data. If we had like 20 waves, that would be much more information to work with and being able to identify. So we are gathering additional waves of data to basically count for the fact that there may be an information problem. So we can partly sort of could partly address that. There is also always this question about time lags, of course. How long would it take for news choices or changes here? We're talking about intra-individual changes. How long would it take for them to materialize as ideological reinforcement effects and also in news choices? So that is also a methodological part of the explanation. But thank you very much.
Great, thank you. I think we can move on now to Team Amsterdam. I'm not sure who between Linda, Jakob, and Artemis is presenting, but we look forward to your paper too.
Thank you very much, Jason. Can you see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm presenting this paper I wrote together with Jakob Ohme, who's now working at the Weizenbaum Institute in Berlin, actually. So not anymore in Amsterdam, but he's still affiliated to Amsterdam. And Artemis Tsoulos-Malakoudi, who's our very talented research master student. And we wrote a paper on curating political animosity, the relation of algorithmic news curation to ideological extremity and social and political intolerance. Now this should, yeah, it goes to the next slide. Okay. So this paper is concerned with hostility or animosity between citizens, so which is of course related to polarization, which was referred to in the previous papers, or presentations, but it's somewhat different. So specifically, we're interested in social and political intolerance, and social intolerance refers to the extent to which people are less willing to interact with people they disagree with or whose views they oppose. And political intolerance actually goes a step further, and this is related to the extent to which people are less willing to not only interact with people, or less willing to interact with people they disagree with, but also less willing to grant them their civil rights. So they think that these people should not be allowed to demonstrate or run for public office, for instance. Now, we know that social and political intolerance is at least present in society and maybe even on the rise. Also in Europe, there's some research, recent research on that. And we know the people who are more ideologically extreme are more likely to be intolerant because they feel more threatened in their identity by these opposing others who are, of course, there are more of them if you're on the ends of the political spectrum, right? Now, what we want to know is what the role of the information environment and the online information environment specifically can be in increasing this political animosity or maybe even decreasing it. And first of all, we know, and that has been referred to before today, of course, that a free flow of political arguments should prevent animosity, right? So we saw that in Jacob's presentation. If you see more opposing arguments, you're less likely to be more negative about, or to become more extreme in your attitudes. And this could also lead to more understanding of the others and decrease of the threat perceptions. But we know that people in online social media, of course, also engage in behavior that prevents this free flow of arguments. And what we look at in this paper is news curation behavior. And news curation is behavior in which people unfriend or block certain information or certain friends on social media, or they like or follow certain pages or people because they're interested in them or less interested in them. And this active engagement with content on social media that directly determines what you see, right? So you see less of certain information or more directly, but also on the longer in the future, because the information that is generated by this news curation also feeds into algorithmic decision processes. So this news curation behavior could actually change the diversity of information you're exposed to. And that's why we raised a very general question: what's the relationship between personal news curation, ideological extremity, and social and political intolerance? Now, we have a few expectations. First of all, based on a lot of previous research, we assume that people who are more extreme are more likely to be socially and politically intolerant. So that's there's a lot of research on that before. And we also assume that people who are more extreme are more willing to avoid cognitive dissonance and avoid opposing views. And this might also lead to more news curation behavior. And there's some evidence for that, but it's sort of mixed. So we're not completely sure, but we do expect that. And then finally, the question, of course, is why would this affect intolerance? Now, news curation shapes your news diet directly, as I just said, but because of these algorithm decisions also in the future. And this could lead to a reinforcing spiral if exposure to like-minded information is increased and exposure to opposing information is decreased. This could reinforce your attitude, and this could lead into a spiraling process, right? So that's the assumption. Now, we need two conditions for this process. First of all, we need people who actually curate their newsfeed, but also who are actually exposed to algorithmic news, so to political information. So it's only when you're exposed to a lot of political information in a very curated feed, so a feed with only like-minded information, that this interplay can set the spiral in motion. On the other hand, if you curate very little and see very little political news actually on social media, then we don't really expect this relationship to exist or this spiral to set into motion. So we compare different curator types with different levels of algorithmic news exposure and different levels of news curation. And we raised the research question: how are different curator types moderating the relationship between ideological extremity and political animosity? Now, how did we study this? We had a cross-sectional survey of Dutch citizens collected in the winter of 2020, a very diverse sample. We simply measured ideological extremity based on left-right placement, and we tapped social and political intolerance towards opponents on one of four issues: immigration, climate change, Black Pete, so that's a very Dutch discussion. You can ask me all about it later, and COVID measures. Subsequently, people were exposed to 4 social intolerance items and 4 political intolerance items. So how did we do this? So first of all, people gave their opinion on each of these 4 issues, and then they were randomly exposed to opponents on one of these issues. So for instance, if people had pro-immigration attitudes, they were asked to rate on a scale from 1 to 7 their agreement with the statement, I would not interact with a colleague who strongly opposes immigration. So that was social intolerance. And for political intolerance, a person who strongly opposes immigration should be able to teach in a university or college. Now, of course, the letter was recoded the other way around. News curator types we based on algorithmic news exposure, so which was simply how often do you receive information about political topics on social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. And personal news curation was based on Thorson and Wells, and we had 6 different types of news curation, such as liking or reacting with other emojis to content from certain news sources to see more or less of the content they post and share. And then we made a scale out of that. And then we did a median split and made 4 different types of news curators, we call them. So we have the tech news avoiders, they curate very little and they see very little political information on social media. Then we have the news omnivores, they see a lot of information, but they don't really curate that. Then we have the news limiters, they curate a lot, but they see very little political news. And the news boosters, who see a lot of algorithmic news, and also curate a lot. And then actually we just ran various regression analysis and added various controls. What we find, completely in line with previous research, ideological extremity predicts social and political intolerance, but it doesn't predict the amount of news curation. So it's not the case that people who are more extreme ideologically, that they're more likely to curate their news feed. We also did a multinomial logit regression analysis in which we find that the news omnivores and the news boosters are slightly more extremist than news avoiders. And the news omnivores were those who saw a lot of algorithmic news and the news boosters too, but only the news boosters were those who curated a lot. So overall, this actually seems to indicate that it's the people who if people are more extreme, they're more likely to use more algorithmic news, but they're not more likely to curate. Now, of course, we were most interested in the relationship between ideological extremity and social and political intolerance for these 4 different news curators. And what we see is that, so here we just plotted them for both dependent variables, and we see that the relationships are very similar. So yeah, for social and political intolerance, the results are almost the same. And as I said, right, ideological extremity predicts social and political intolerance. So there's a positive relationship, and this is more prominent or more clear actually for the news omnivores and the news boosters. So the ones that use a lot of algorithmic news use. It's actually negative for the news limiters. So the people actually who curate a lot but see very little political news. So for them, there's a negative relationship. And for the tech avoiders, it's somewhat non-existent. So our conclusion is that ideological extremity doesn't predict news curation practices, but it does predict algorithmic news use. And most importantly, a curated news diet, even for citizens with extreme viewpoints, is not necessarily positively related to social and political intolerance. It only is when news use is high. A lower intake of news, especially if it's curated, can limit the impact of extremity on political intolerance. So that's, yeah, maybe a positive finding. And a high intake of algorithmic news has the potential to start a reinforcing spiral of intolerance, regardless of the amount of news curation. Of course, we have a few points for discussion. We only have correlational evidence based on self-reported measures, so we cannot say much about causality. Our measure of news curation is new based on previous measures, but in this case, what's important is it doesn't really tap the curation of political or news information. So it's just a curation of your feed in general, also just of entertainment or cat pictures. We lump together intolerant attitudes on 4 items and 4 different issues. And it might be interesting to actually look at the reinforcing spirals or the relation between extremity and intolerance for these different issues, right? Also with the last presentation in mind. That's it. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Jakob, Adam, and Linda are my 3 favorite people for today. 3 really good and on-time presentations. As Christian said in the chat, y'all run the IJPP runs a tight ship. So same thing as before. I'll ask a quick question to give people a chance to think of questions or comments they want to ask. And so my question really comes sort of straight out of the last presentation, which is, how much do you think the results are sensitive or would be different based on your measure of ideology? Is this a sort of traditional left-right economic dimension? And if you add a more cultural conflict dimension, do you think the results are going to be the same? Or is this something that you have in your survey, the data, to be able to try and explore and consider? And sorry, Adam, if I stole your question.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, of course, especially after reading Adam's paper and so seeing the presentation, this is something that also came to my mind. So what we use is just left-right placement. And in the Netherlands, that's very much connected to the socio-economic cleavage and not so much to the cultural dimension. What we could do, so we don't have a measure of the social, cultural, ideological dimension. And I do think that it would be interesting to look into that, definitely. What we could do is use these attitude measures, so on the different socio-cultural issues that we have to sort of tap into that. But of course, that's very much related to the intolerance measures we have. So we could look into the data, whether there's something else, but I'm not sure. Yeah, but it's a good point. Yeah.
Okay, I think there's a comment question from Christian.
Yeah, just a comment really that we tend often to focus on news consumption as based on the assumption that it's a good thing. And one of the takeaways from your study is that if people limit their news intake, they actually, their ideology doesn't correlate with their levels of intolerance, which makes some sense, right? If you have strong views and you're gonna get a lot of news, that news will likely reinforce them, and therefore you'll likely become less tolerant of those who disagree with you. But I think just as an observation, it's an interesting finding that perhaps we should take into account when we assume necessarily that news is good for everyone all the time. In this case, although it's correlation, it doesn't seem that it's like it.
Yeah, good point. Somewhat disappointing still, of course. There's a positive consequence of using little news. Yeah, good point. Yeah.
So I think I see another comment in the chat that is asking about, so is ideology, if I'm interpreting the comment correctly, is ideology a useful construct to try and structure your analyses there? So reading the presentation, the comment, thanks for the presentation.
Ambassador Hamada, this is
oh, perfect. Okay, great.
Yeah,
I'll let you ask it.
Yeah. Well, it's a very clear. Yeah, yes, I do believe that there is no ideological orientation nowadays that can affect the communication behavior, and therefore the paper seems that is based on a construct that is to a great extent is not existent at the time being. How do the researcher explain this? Thank you very much.
Yes, good point. Well, I think in the Netherlands, this is still a very relevant dimension, right? So left-right dimension does still predict a lot of political behavior, especially. I don't know. Yeah, and also still news use. So I think it is a relevant construct. Of course, there is sort of a big leap between assuming that people who are very extreme on this left-right ideology, so this left-right ideology in the Netherlands, I have to add, also sort of lumps together the social-cultural and the socio-economic dimension. It's sort of a blurry dimension. Whether people who are more extreme on that also have a social identity that's connected to this very left-right extreme dimension. And that's, of course, a question for future research. I do think indeed that looking into this social cultural dimension would be interesting. So, and that actually might explain more, it would also be more relevant. But I'm not sure whether I agree whether there's no place for the ideology construct right now, especially in the Netherlands.
Can I ask another question? Well, I'm the chair. I can give myself that. So I mean, one of the limitations that all research like this faces, that your paper faces, that Adam faces before, is the use of the self-report data, and in terms of particularly on the sort of media consumption side, and like, how have you thought about like what avenues are there to try and get over the problems of the self-reported data? You know, because the work is really cool and I really like it, but then what I've done enough of this stuff myself to know that R2 is going to come back and say, well, this is just self-report data, and why should we believe it? Because everybody knows that self-report data is wrong. So I guess it's both for Linda and for Adam. Like, what are the path forward? We don't all have budgets for trace data, and trace data is still only a small, tiny part of what people's total media diets are. So any thoughts as to how we solve this problem? So in the remaining 7 minutes, solve one of the biggest problems facing our discipline. Go.
Yeah. Well, this is really not my expertise. So, I wonder whether my co-author Jakob can help a bit out here. You know much more about this. I would say in general, I think of course it's a problem, but especially I personally am very much interested in this concept of intolerance, and I think you can indeed use digital trace data or whatever, or some other kind of social media data to get at news use, but you cannot really measure intolerance with that. So I think as long as you're interested in individuals' attitudes, you need some kind of survey at least attached to that. So, but for news exposure, well, it's very difficult. Yeah.
That's a strong answer. I disagree with the premise of the question. It's always a strong answer.
Can I jump in, or?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I think this is also a very good question, and something we repeatedly discuss within our group, of course. And I think that, I mean, looking at the field, there is like one trend moving towards becoming more and more specific in what you're measuring. You want to really track people's like online behavior and link that to certain attitudes or behaviors, and that is really cool. And another trend is like, okay, but we should care more about the bigger picture, about media's people's like their basic media diets. And those are oftentimes multi-platform, and how do you basically combine those two lines of research. I think that's a that's a massive challenge, and I think, of course, they are good in what they focus on, but it feels like the problem is becoming bigger and bigger in that sense. Yeah, so not really a solution, but just a reflection of how different sort of strands of research move within our field.
Maybe if I can, I mean, I totally agree with Adam. I think there are two ways forward, and we are always a bit trapped in that we actually want to produce results with concepts that we kind of like care and that are already there, and then there is kind of like innovation in how to gather data. And if you bring this together, and I've done this, you can never be really sure whether this is because your data collection approach is new, or because you actually found something based on the concepts that you use. So I think two ways forward would be also starting with Jakob's presentation, more realistic, ecologically valid experimental studies can actually be, I think, helpful. And we have now the tools and the power to actually conduct this. So if you do a selection that is, I don't know, among a couple of hundred articles in the newsfeed, you might get to something that is a bit more realistic than if you have like 5 items or something like this. So I think working on still these artificial environments could be one way forward. And the other one is, and that's what Adam said, and I think this is going to be one of the greater challenges of the next years, is data integration. So we have to merge data, exposure data from different sources. We now have the tools more or less to get trace data by data donations. You can do screen tracking on smartphones, and you can kind of like enrich this with experience sampling methods and so on and so forth. So it is there, but the integration for an individual, basically, to get this on an individual level, this will be the big challenge. And we are always, and this is exactly where we are lacking behind, right? So we are kind of like innovating in methods, but still then kind of like play it more safe on with the panel data or the cross-sectional data, because we don't want to mix these two, because that could kind of like also point us into directions we are not too certain about. So I think this is the explanation of why no one went that far with trace data in this panel, at least. But I'm sure we will see more and maybe a bit more ecologically valid data in the future.
I think that's a fantastic answer and a high point to end on, so people can have a full 1 minute break before the next panel starts. Thank you all very much. What terrific job to the presenters. 3 great papers, 3 great presentations. Thank you very much.
Yes, and thank you very much, Jason. Excellent sharing. And the session was very, very smooth and a very, very good start to our day. I think if people are here already, we can start the next panel, which is titled Debative the Normative Foundations of the News. And I think it will definitely continue some of the conversations we're having about the findings from the previous presentations. There are some other questions in the chat for the panelists or for everyone, and I encourage people to continue talking about these issues in the chat even as we are moving on to a different panel.